Snow drifted across the valley like sheets of glass dust, sweeping down from the ridges and burying the small Montana town of Cedar Creek in silence. Winter here was not just a season, it was a siege. Every porch beam groaned under the weight of ice, every roof sagged with frost. On the outskirts of town, an old cattle auction barn clung to life beneath the storm, its red paint peeling, its tin roof patched and dented. Inside, the air was a thick stew of damp wool, wood smoke, and wet fur. Heat lamps flickered above pens made from metal rails, throwing dull orange circles on the dirt floor. Dogs of every size and shape crouched behind wire gates, some whining, some barking themselves hoarse, others simply curled in silence. A banner hung crooked across the rafters: County Animal Dispersal, Public Auction. The crowd was sparse. Ranchers with calloused hands, a few bargain hunters, and men whose eyes didn't seem interested in pets at all. Their boots tracked slush across the sawdust floor. Their voices rose and fell with the rhythm of bidding, sometimes sharp, sometimes dismissive. At the very back sat a German shepherd, unlike the rest. His black saddle coat had dulled to a brownish shadow, his ribs pressed faintly against thin skin. One ear was nicked with a scar, healed unevenly. He did not bark or whine. Instead, he sat perfectly still, amber eyes watching everything with unsettling calm. His tag read, Shadow. The auctioneer, Gil Trent, a man with a wind-chapped face and a sheepskin coat, smacked his clipboard against the rail. Last one for the day, folks. German Shepherd, about 5 years old. No papers, no records, no bids so far. Who'll start me at 50? Silence. Someone muttered from the benches. Mean dog. Another scoffed. Damaged goods. Shadow didn't flinch. At the side of the pen stood Deputy Luke Harrison, his sheriff's badge glinting faintly beneath the weak barn light. 36, broad-shouldered, storm-gray eyes, his dark hair flecked silver at the temples. He had been in Cedar Creek for only 3 months, long enough to know the winters bit harder here than anywhere else, long enough to feel the weight of a town that hid its ghosts beneath the snow. Luke hadn't come to the auction for a pet. Rumors had reached his desk that these dispersals doubled as cover for something else, trafficking, stolen animals, maybe worse. But when his gaze met Shadow's, a current seemed to move through the cold air. This dog wasn't afraid, he was waiting. Gil cleared his throat. 20? 10? No hands rose. Luke lifted his. 1. The crowd broke into laughter. $1? Sheriff's office must be broke. Buy in trouble, deputy. Gil frowned, then shrugged. Sold. $1. To the officer. Luke stepped forward, unlatched the cage door. Easy, he murmured, slipping a plain leash over Shadow's head. The dog stood without hesitation, muscles lean and coiled, amber eyes steady on Luke's face. Up close, Luke noticed scars inside the ear, deliberate, as if marked once upon a time. From across the barn, a camera clicked. Luke glanced up to see Megan Whitaker, chestnut hair curling from under a wool cap, maroon jacket zipped against the cold, camera strap looped around her neck. She lowered the lens, her breath clouding in the icy air. You just made a very interesting purchase, she said. Luke narrowed his eyes. Press? Independent, investigating Cedar Creek's missing person case. Her voice was low, carrying urgency. 2 years ago, my brother, Adam Whitaker, vanished near Black Creek Gorge. He was driving an armored van, and his K9 partner vanished too. She glanced at Shadow. That dog had a scar in its ear, just like him. Luke tugged the leash gently. Lots of dogs have scars. Megan stepped closer, her voice firm. Lots of dogs don't disappear with a man who was about to expose a bank scandal. Luke didn't answer. He guided Shadow out of the barn. Outside, the cold hit like a hammer. Snow whirled sideways, plastering Shadow's coat in white specks. The dog shook once, then leapt into the back of Luke's patrol SUV, curling onto the rubber mat as if he had done it before. Megan followed, her camera hugged tight against her jacket. You know what you've got there? Luke shut the rear door with a thud. A dog nobody else wanted. Sometimes, she murmured, eyes on Shadow. The ones nobody wants, know things nobody else can. The drive back to the substation was silent but heavy. Cedar Creek slid past in shades of gray snow-shuttered storefronts, sagging awnings, the town looking half buried in sleep. In the rearview mirror, Shadow sat upright, breath fogging the glass, gaze never wavering. At the station, Luke led him inside. The building smelled of coffee and wood smoke, its stone walls creaking with the storm. He laid out a blanket in the kennel room, poured water into a bowl. Shadow drank, then sat back on his haunches, ears rotating toward every creak of the old structure. Vigilant. Luke crouched, brushing the dog's chest fur aside. Beneath, faint ink traced a rectangle, numbers blurred, nearly erased. He frowned, pulled out the handheld microchip scanner. He swept it over Shadow's shoulder blade. The device buzzed weakly, sputtered, then blinked a fractured line of text. Slowly, jagged letters formed on the tiny screen. Missing witness, Black Creek. Luke froze. The phrase hit like a punch. Black Creek, 2 years ago. Adam Whitaker's case, the one file that refused to die, even after the snow had buried every lead. He looked back at Shadow. The German Shepherd was watching him with eerie stillness, amber eyes fixed, as if he understood. "What did you see out there?" Luke whispered. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Megan appeared in the doorway, cheeks red from the cold, notebook in hand. She stepped closer, eyes locked on the scanner still glowing in Luke's hand. "I told you," she said softly. "That dog isn't just another rescue. He's the only witness left." Shadow flicked his ears at her voice, then shifted closer to Luke's leg, silent but deliberate. The storm howled outside, rattling the window panes. Inside, the clock ticked steady as a heartbeat. Luke's jaw tightened. He had planned to file a simple report, to forget the auction. But now, with $1 and one scarred dog, the past had clawed its way back to life. Megan knelt a few feet away, her breath uneven. "Adam's last message to me said, 'If anything happens, Ranger knows where to go.' Everyone thought he meant the dog was dead. But what if he meant this one? What if Shadow remembers?" Luke stared at the German Shepherd, at the faded tattoo on his chest, at the way his body leaned toward the door as if ready to guide them. "You're safe now," Luke murmured. But even as he said it, he knew safety wasn't what this dog had been waiting for. The wind shrieked against the siding. Snow rattled down the gutter pipes like pebbles. Somewhere deep inside the station, the phone rang twice and fell silent. Shadow rose to his feet, ears pricked, muscles taut. He padded to the door, pressed his nose to the seam, and gave a low rumble in his throat as if something outside was already waiting. Luke's eyes followed him, unease prickling his skin. Megan's whisper was barely audible. "Where is he trying to take us?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the storm pressed tighter against Cedar Creek. The storm had eased by morning, but Cedar Creek still lay trapped under a hard crust of ice. Rooflines sagged beneath white weight, roads shone with treachery, and the pine forest that hemmed the town stood like a cathedral of shadows. Deputy Luke Harrison zipped his heavy coat and clipped the long lead to Shadow's collar. The German Shepherd stood tall now, his ribs still visible, but his posture purposeful, as though the night had sharpened his resolve. Megan Whitaker trailed them, notebook tucked inside her jacket, her camera wrapped in cloth to keep it from fogging in the cold. Her eyes, swollen from lack of sleep, carried both dread and determination. "Where are we going?" she asked. Luke adjusted his gloves. "Let's see if he shows us." Shadow sniffed once at the air, then pulled north with steady pressure. Not the zigzag of an undisciplined dog, but a clear trajectory, head high, ears forward. Luke allowed him to lead, his own boots crunching on the frozen road. Megan kept close behind. The farther they moved from town, the quieter the world became. The hum of plows faded, replaced by the muted rush of a half-frozen creek under the snow. Crows wheeled overhead, their cries slicing the stillness. Soon, the narrow road broke into wilderness. A wooden bridge spanned the Black Creek Gorge, a place Luke knew only from files, photographs, and grim speculation. 2 years ago, Adam Whitaker's armored truck had been found here, abandoned and stripped, the cash inside gone. Adam himself vanished. Search teams had combed the area for days, nothing. Shadow tugged harder as they neared the bridge. His paws slipped once on the frost, but he recovered and led them across. Luke's heart thudded against his ribs. He had not expected the dog to take them here so quickly. At the far side, Shadow slowed, nose working. He circled a fallen log, half buried in snow, then began to dig furiously, sending powder flying into the air. His claws raked down to frozen earth, scraping until they struck something solid. "Hold on," Luke murmured, kneeling beside him. He cleared the snow with gloved hands. Something metallic gleamed beneath the frost, a wristwatch, the strap torn and stiff with age. He turned it over carefully, the back bore initials etched in gold. Megan's breath caught. "That's Adam's. Our grandfather gave it to him. He wore it every day." Luke's stomach tightened. He slid the watch into an evidence bag from his coat pocket. Beside it, Shadow scraped again, revealing a scrap of blue fabric caught on a thorn root. A shirt fragment, faintly stained. 2 years, Luke muttered. And this was still here. The forest pressed silent around them. Luke's ears rang with the weight of discovery. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof Adam had been here after the truck was abandoned. Megan crouched close, her voice trembling. "Do you see now? He's not just a rescue, he remembers. Luke didn't reply. His instincts as a deputy screamed at him to call this in, to preserve the site, but his gut told him the moment he filed a report, the case might be buried again under red tape. He needed more. The click of a camera shutter snapped the silence. Megan was already photographing the evidence, her fingers shaking as she adjusted focus. Luke frowned, but didn't stop her. Then, faint movement at the tree line. Megan froze. A man stood half-concealed behind a spruce, a cigarette ember glowing near his face. He was broad-shouldered, his padded jacket stained at the cuffs, a ball cap pulled low over his brow. Even at a distance, Megan recognized him. "Clint Maddox," she whispered. Luke followed her gaze. The man exhaled smoke, watching them with expressionless eyes. Then, as Megan raised her camera instinctively, he turned away sharply, disappearing into the trees. The ember winked out like a dying star. "Who the hell was that?" Luke hissed. "Former bank security," Megan said, her pulse racing. "He was on duty the day Adam vanished. He's been on my list since the beginning." Luke scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just snow-laden branches swaying in the wind. "We're leaving," he said firmly. He bagged the evidence, clipped Shadow's leash, and pulled Megan back toward the bridge. Shadow's ears flicked constantly, his gaze darting behind them as if tracking unseen movement. The snow muffled every footstep, but the sense of being watched clung like a weight on Luke's shoulders. They crossed the bridge quickly. Midway across, Megan whispered, "He knows we're on the trail now." Luke didn't answer. His jaw clenched, breath rising in plumes. He forced them back to the road, back toward the distant outline of Cedar Creek. By the time they reached the SUV, Luke's pulse had steadied, but his mind had not. He opened the rear door. Shadow leapt in without hesitation, tail low, eyes still alert. Megan climbed into the passenger seat, hugging her camera to her chest. As Luke started the engine, snow flurries swept across the windshield, erasing their tracks almost instantly. The road back wound in uneasy silence. Megan finally broke it. "That was proof, Luke. The watch, the fabric. And Clint Maddox, he wouldn't have been out there unless he was guarding something." Luke kept his eyes on the road. "Proof is fragile. We need more." She turned toward him, voice sharp. "If you don't push this, they'll bury it again, like they always do." He shot her a look. "And if we push too soon, we could lose everything. I've seen cases collapse because evidence wasn't airtight. I won't risk it." Megan stared at him, anger and fear knotted in her chest. "Then, what do you call what just happened?" Shadow just pulled 2 years of silence out of the ground. Luke gripped the wheel tighter. She wasn't wrong, but neither was his fear. The SUV climbed toward town, its tires crunching over ice. The sheriff's station loomed ahead, a squat fortress of stone and timber. Luke parked in the garage and killed the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. The storm rattled against the metal roof. Inside the vehicle, the only sound was Shadow's steady breathing, fogging the glass. Luke finally spoke. "We've got evidence, we've got a witness, and now we've got enemies watching." Megan's reply was almost a whisper. "Then the question is, what's next?" Shadow raised his head, amber eyes gleaming in the dim light, ears angled toward the north as though he already knew. His body tensed, muscles coiling, nose pressed against the window. Luke followed his gaze. Somewhere beyond the town, past the snowy ridges and black pine stands, the dog was fixed on something neither of them could see. The wind groaned through the rafters. Luke felt the hair rise on his neck. Shadow gave a low, steady growl, then turned back to Luke, eyes burning with intent. It wasn't random. It was a signal. And it left Luke with a single unspoken question. Where does he want us to follow next? The next afternoon broke beneath a brittle sky, pale light slicing through thin clouds that never warmed the air. Snow had crusted into a glassy shell across Cedar Creek's back roads, making every step and tire squeal like a warning. Deputy Luke Harrison adjusted his scarf as he let Shadow down from the SUV. The dog landed with a fluid grace, nose twitching, ears swiveling toward the dark wall of pines that crowded the northern ridge. Megan trailed a few steps behind, breath clouding the air, her boots sinking into the drifts that lined the old trailhead. She had traded her maroon jacket for a heavier parka, a knit hat pulled tight over her chestnut hair. The camera hung at her side now, not raised her instincts told her that whatever they found, the lens might not be enough to protect them. Shadow moved with certainty. He did not meander or pause to sniff idly. His body cut a straight line as if pulled by memory, not scent. Luke followed, every sense sharpened. The forest was hushed, only the faint creak of snow-laden branches and the distant groan of ice shifting deep in the gorge. After half a mile, the dog stopped. His paws scraped at the snowbank beneath a thicket of pine. He turned sharply, tail stiff, and pawed again. claws striking frozen metal. Luke hurried forward, brushing snow aside until the outline emerged. A half-buried concrete structure, its roof disguised by earth and roots. A rusted steel door leaned off its hinges, the paint mottled with corrosion. Megan whispered, "What is this place?" Luke's voice was tight. Cold War storage. Old bunkers like these were used for fuel, sometimes supply caches. Most were sealed decades ago. Shadow shoved his nose at the gap in the doorway and let out a low bark, sharp and demanding. Luke drew his flashlight, tested the frame, then pushed the door aside. The hinges screeched, and a stale draft wafted out oil, rust, something darker. He stepped in first, the beam cutting through gloom. Megan followed, one hand clutching her scarf against her face. Inside, the bunker was a cavern of shadows. Coils of rope lay stiff with frost in one corner. Empty oil drums towered along the wall, their hazard markings faded. Against the far side leaned a large sign, its paint chipped, its bolts sheared, reading in stenciled letters, Black Creek Bank, Armored Services. Megan drew in a sharp breath. That's from Adam's route. Her camera clicked rapidly, flashes painting the chamber in bursts of white. Luke crouched by the rope. He ran a gloved finger along the fibers. Dark stains crusted into the strands. He scraped a sample into an evidence bag. His jaw clenched. "Binding," he muttered. "Somebody was tied up in here." Shadow's hackles rose suddenly. He backed away from a stack of drums, ears flat, tail low. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. Luke swung the flashlight toward the corner. Nothing. Just twisted metal and black stains on the floor. But then came the sound faint, outside the crunch of tires over snow. He killed the light instantly. Through the doorway, the beam of headlights swept across the trees. A truck engine coughed, idled, then cut. Silence pressed in again, thick and deliberate. Megan's pulse thudded in her ears. She raised her camera, snapping once through the gap, capturing the shadow of an old boxy truck parked just beyond the tree line. Its paint was faded green, its windows fogged. "Same make Adam drove," she whispered. "Same damn color." Luke's mind raced. Was it a decoy? Surveillance? He pressed Shadow to heel, one hand on the dog's flank, steadying the tremor in his muscles. The shepherd quivered but obeyed, crouching low, eyes burning at the doorway. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the engine coughed again, belching smoke, and the truck backed slowly down the track until the pines swallowed it whole. The silence afterward was almost worse. Megan's hands shook as she lowered her camera. "They know we're here." Luke exhaled through his nose, steadying his nerves. "And now we know they've been watching." He sealed the rope fibers, snapped photos of the sign, the serial numbers etched into the drums. Every action felt like a gamble against time. Shadow stayed glued to his side, nose working, tail rigid. When they stepped back into the open air, the world felt sharper, hostile. The wind cut across the ridge, stirring snow from branches and small avalanches. Luke led them quickly to the SUV. Shadow hesitated at the threshold, casting one last glance back toward the bunker, ears flicking as if memorizing the place. Inside the vehicle, warmth returned slowly from the vents. Megan sat in silence, scrolling through the photos on her camera. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "This proves Adam was held there. It proves Calloway's network isn't just rumor." Luke kept his eyes on the road. "It proves someone will kill to keep it quiet." Her hands tightened around the camera. "Then we're in deeper than we realize." The SUV rolled back into Cedar Creek, headlights reflecting off shuttered storefronts. The town looking smaller now, more fragile. The storm was returning, snow beginning to fall in dry spirals. Back at the station, Luke locked the evidence into a secure cabinet. The smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted through the halls, almost domestic, but the tension hung heavy. Megan leaned against the desk, arms folded, eyes still sharp with adrenaline. Shadow settled on the floor between them, but his ears twitched constantly, as if the silence carried more weight than sound. Luke finally spoke. "You wanted the truth. Now you've got pieces of it. But understand this, every piece we pull is going to shake something loose." Megan met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let it shake. Adam deserves nothing less." Outside, snow thickened, turning the windows into frosted glass. The station's heater hummed, the only fragile comfort. Shadow lifted his head, staring at the door. A low growl rippled in his throat again, not panic, but recognition. His eyes narrowed, fixed on something neither Luke nor Megan could see. Luke crouched, hand resting on the dog's neck. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't move. He just stared, steady and unblinking, toward the north. The storm rattled against the glass. Megan's breath caught. She whispered, "If the bunker was just the beginning, where is he trying to take us next?" The question lingered, sharp as ice, as Shadow rose to his feet, body tense, waiting. Snow fell in heavy veils that afternoon, turning Cedar Creek into a muted painting of white and gray. The courthouse dome disappeared behind the storm, storefronts blurred like old photographs. Deputy Luke Harrison sat in the dim light of the sheriff's station. Evidence spread across the scarred oak table, photographs of the bunker, the rope fibers, the bank sign. Megan Whitaker leaned over the table, her fingers tracing lines on the map she had pinned down with coffee mugs. "You see this?" she said, tapping a section of farmland west of town, technically listed under a shell company. But the deed traces back to Richard Calloway. Luke studied the map. The land was marked as abandoned dairy property, 20 miles outside Cedar Creek. On paper, just another casualty of the farm crisis. In reality, Megan's research connected it to Calloway Logistics, the same company that had supplied armored routes for Black Creek Bank 2 years earlier. Calloway, Luke muttered. He had heard the name whispered in reports, always tied to rumors, never pinned down with facts. A man who smiled at ribbon cuttings and signed checks at church fundraisers but left shadows in his wake. Megan pulled a photo from her bag taken at the county fair last fall. Calloway, tall and heavy-set, his silver hair slicked back beneath a black Stetson. He stood beside a truck, gesturing to a handler loading cages. "He was at the dog auction," Megan said. "Donated money. Probably moved animals the same way he moves everything else quietly." Luke clenched his jaw. "Which means Shadow didn't lead us to that bunker by accident. Calloway's fingerprints are everywhere." At the mention of his name, the German shepherd lifted his head from the floor. His ears pricked, nostrils flaring as if the very syllables carried a scent. He rose, padding to the table, and pressed his nose against the photo. A low whine escaped his throat. Megan's breath hitched. "He recognizes him." Luke exchanged a glance with her. This wasn't evidence a court would take, but it was enough for him. He grabbed his coat. "We pay Calloway a visit." The warehouse sat on the edge of the old railway spur, a rectangle of corrugated steel, half buried under snowdrifts. Diesel fumes hung heavy in the yard where trucks idled, their headlights cutting through the storm. A faded sign read, "Calloway Logistics." Inside, warmth clashed with the stink of machine oil. Pallets of freight towered under industrial lights. Men in fleece vests moved crates with forklifts, their faces wary as Luke stepped through the glass doors into the front office. A receptionist in his 40s, wiry with a crow tattoo on his wrist, greeted him with a smile too sharp to be genuine. "Can I help you, deputy?" Luke flashed his badge. "Routine checks, winter preparedness, supply routes. New to town, learning the landscape." The man nodded, gestured toward the back. "Mr. Calloway's here. He'll be glad to talk." Moments later, Richard Calloway appeared. Taller than Luke expected, broad-chested with the stride of a man who once hauled freight, but now carried power instead of weight. His pale green eyes studied Luke as though measuring him for weakness. "Deputy Harrison," he said smoothly, extending a gloved hand. "Welcome to Cedar Creek." Luke shook it, noting the clammy dampness despite the cold. "Appreciate your time. Just checking on routes, storage, that sort of thing." Calloway's smile tightened. "We're always prepared. Winter doesn't forgive carelessness." His gaze flicked to Megan, who had slipped in quietly, notebook at her side. "And you are?" "Freelance press," Megan said with a polite smile. "Covering infrastructure." Calloway's lips curved. "We like good press." As he spoke, Luke caught a faint smell rising from his coat oil, leather, and beneath it, something familiar. The bunker. Shadow sat in the SUV outside, but even through the glass, his hackles rose, his body pressing against the window as though trying to reach the man inside. Luke asked harmless questions about snow chains, fuel reserves, shipping delays. Calloway answered with the ease of a man used to public scrutiny. But twice, his eyes darted toward the receptionist, who slipped out quietly as though summoned by invisible command. Megan noticed. She scribbled one word in her notebook and slid it toward Luke. Surveillance. Luke ended the conversation quickly, shook Calloway's hand again, and left. The cold outside felt cleaner, though the storm stung like needles. He climbed into the SUV, Shadow instantly pressing his nose to his coat as if tracking the lingering scent of Calloway. Megan buckled in, glancing at the rearview mirror. "Black pickup, 2 cars back. It's been following since we left the warehouse." Luke checked discreetly. A dark truck with tinted windows kept its distance, headlights faint through the snow. "Don't look again," Luke muttered. He took a side street, winding through residential blocks until the pickup disappeared. Megan exhaled shakily. "He knows we're onto him." Luke didn't respond. His hands tightened on the wheel. Back at the station, they spread photos across the table again. Megan traced the overlap of Calloway's trucking routes with Adam's missing armored run. The pattern was undeniable. "He's been moving more than freight," she said. "Dogs, money, maybe people. The auctions were a cover." Luke nodded grimly. "And Maddox is one of his eyes. That explains why he was at the gorge." Shadow curled under the table, his body tense but calmer now. Megan reached down and stroked his head. This time, the dog leaned into her touch, eyes softening. Trust was building, fragile but real. Luke glanced at the evidence cabinet, then back at Megan. "We're not enough. This is bigger than county jurisdiction." She tilted her head. "You mean FBI?" He nodded. "I'll call Denver tonight." Outside, the storm howled louder, rattling the station windows. Luke picked up the phone, his other hand resting on Shadow's neck. The dog's ears twitched, nose pointed toward the north again, as if waiting. He dialed, gave the evidence summary, the photos, the bunker, Calloway's name. On the other end, Agent Daniel Mercer's voice was calm but clipped, promising swift review. When Luke hung up, Megan's eyes were bright with both hope and dread. "So what now?" Luke exhaled slowly. "Now we wait to see how deep this goes." Shadow shifted suddenly, rising to his feet, tail stiff. He moved to the window, growling low. His body was rigid, every sense locked on something outside. Luke crossed quickly, peered through the frosted glass. Headlights. A dark pickup idled across the street, engine purring under the storm. And this time, it didn't drive away. The black pickup sat across from the sheriff's station like a predator in the snow. Its engine rumbled low, headlights hazed by falling flakes, windows tinted into obsidian. Deputy Luke Harrison stood by the frosted glass, jaw set, every muscle tight as Shadow's growl rose behind him. Megan hovered near the evidence table, notebook clutched to her chest. "Is it him?" she whispered. Luke didn't answer. He reached for the light switch, plunging the office into dim shadow. Outside, the pickup didn't move. It just waited, an unspoken threat pressed against the storm. Shadow padded to the door, hackles raised, teeth bared in silence. His amber eyes locked on the truck like he could see through the tinted glass, see the danger crouched inside. Luke pulled his radio, kept his voice level. "Unit 12 to dispatch. Got a suspicious vehicle idling across Main from station. Request plate check." Static crackled, then the dispatcher's voice came back, hushed but steady. "Copy, Unit 12. Running it now." Minutes ticked, each second like a hammer on the ribs. Megan couldn't sit still. She paced near the stove, her boots squeaking on linoleum. Why aren't they moving? Why just watch? Luke's storm-gray eyes flicked to her. "Because they want us to know we're being watched. Intimidation." Before Megan could answer, the radio squawked again. "Unit 12. Plate comes back unregistered, likely falsified. Proceed with caution." Luke cursed under his breath. He grabbed his coat and holstered sidearm. "Stay here," he told Megan. Her voice snapped sharp. "Like hell I will." But before the argument could flare, Shadow lunged at the door, barking once deep, commanding. A sound that filled the station with sudden electricity. Luke hesitated. Instinct told him this wasn't the moment for confrontation. Whoever sat in that truck wanted a reaction. And then, as if to prove the point, the engine revved once, tires spinning on ice. The pickup pulled away, slow at first, then faster, disappearing into the curtain of snow. The silence left behind was worse than its presence. Megan exhaled shakily. "That was a message." Luke nodded grimly. "Yeah, and now we know they're close enough to touch us." Later that night, when the station was locked and the town lay quiet beneath the storm, Luke sat at his desk, staring at the steel evidence box. Megan sat opposite, her face pale in the lamp's glow. Shadow curled at her boots but still restless. Luke rubbed his temples. "We can't wait for Denver to send a team. By the time they get clearance, Calloway will have cleaned house." Megan leaned forward, eyes burning. "Then we go ourselves. He's hiding something at that farm. Shadow already knows it." Luke studied her for a long moment. She wasn't wrong. But bringing her into the field wasn't procedure, wasn't safe. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, as if siding with her. His gaze bore into Luke until Luke muttered, "You're both gonna get me fired." Megan gave a grim smile. Better fired than buried. The next morning dawned brittle, the storm broken into a cruelly clear sky. They drove west, the SUV carving through snow-packed backroads. The world glittered sharp and unforgiving. Megan adjusted her gloves, camera tucked beneath her coat. Shadow stood alert in the back, nose pressed to the window, breath fogging the glass. The farm loomed ahead, Hollow Pines Dairy, its wooden sign dangling from rusted chains. Barns sagged under snow, silos leaning like drunks. The place breathed abandonment, but the tire ruts leading in told another story. Luke parked in the tree line, engine idling low. "We go in quick. Photograph, document, get out." Megan nodded, her pulse hammering. Shadow leapt down first, paws sinking deep, body tense with memory. He led them across the yard to a long barn with doors chained shut. Luke tested the padlock, rusted, but recently disturbed. He broke it with a crowbar from the SUV, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the cold. Inside, sunlight pierced through broken boards, illuminating dust motes and old hay. But the smell, oil, sweat, something chemical lingered heavy. Shadow sniffed once, then darted toward a stack of crates. He pawed at one until it shifted, wood scraping. Luke pried the lid. Inside lay shredded documents, broken seals from Black Creek Bank, scorched lockboxes. Megan snapped photos furiously. Adam tried to expose this, and Calloway destroyed it. In the corner, Luke yanked open a metal cabinet. Uniforms hung inside Black Creek Bank security jackets, name patches stripped, one sleeve stained dark. He sealed a swab sample into a bag, throat tight. Shadow stiffened again, muscles coiled. He turned toward the far door, a growl vibrating low. Luke dropped into a crouch, signaling with a flat palm. "Down." Shadow obeyed instantly, belly pressed to hay, eyes blazing at the threshold. Megan whispered, "What's out there?" Luke didn't answer. He edged closer, flashlight off, ears straining. And then he heard the crunch of boots outside, slow, deliberate. The barn door creaked. A sliver of daylight cut across the hay. Shadow's growl deepened, body trembling like a drawn bow. Luke motioned Megan behind a stack of crates, gun drawn, breath steady. The door opened wider. A man stepped in, tall, gaunt, wearing a grease-stained parka. His face was lined, scar cutting across one cheek. Clint Maddox. Megan's pulse roared in her ears. She knew that face from every list she'd made, every night she'd studied files by lamplight. Maddox scanned the barn slowly, eyes settling on the crates, the sign, the evidence laid bare. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a warning. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. Luke didn't lower his weapon. "Neither should you." For a beat, the only sound was the whistle of wind through broken boards. Then Maddox smirked. "You think you're getting close? You don't know how deep this goes." Before Luke could answer, Shadow lunged forward, teeth bared. The shepherd stopped just short, hackles raised, bark booming off the rafters. Maddox flinched, hand twitching near his jacket too close to where a weapon might hide. Luke's voice cut like steel. "Don't even try." Maddox froze, then slowly lifted both hands. His smile didn't fade. "Doesn't matter. Calloway already knows you're here." Luke cuffed him quickly, securing his wrists. But unease churned in his gut. Maddox hadn't resisted because he was afraid. He had resisted because he didn't need to. Megan whispered, "What does he mean already knows?" Outside, an engine roared to life. Multiple engines. Luke's heart lurched. He dragged Maddox to his feet, motioned Megan to the door. Shadow was already ahead, teeth bared, ears pinned. Through the broken boards of the barn, headlights flared. At least 2 trucks pulled into the yard, tires spitting snow, doors slamming open. Voices barked orders. Boots pounded the ground. Maddox smiled through split lips. "Told you, the trap's already sprung." Luke shoved him toward the crates, trying to think 3 steps ahead. Megan's breath came fast, her camera clutched like a lifeline. Shadow stood rigid, every fiber of him screaming for action. The barn trembled as footsteps closed in. Luke tightened his grip on his weapon, eyes darting between the exits. And then the first beam of a flashlight sliced through the cracks in the wall. They were surrounded. The barn at Hollow Pines felt suddenly smaller, its wooden ribs rattling under the storm and the thunder of engines outside. Deputy Luke Harrison pressed Clint Maddox against a stack of crates, cuffs biting into the man's wrists. Shadow prowled near the doorway, teeth bared, growl vibrating like a live wire through the hay. Megan crouched low beside a toppled bale, camera clutched tight, her breath short and sharp. Headlights carved harsh lines through the cracks in the boards. Voices shouted outside, boots stomping, men fanning into the yard. Maddox grinned, despite the steel on his wrists. "Told you. He knew you'd come." Luke shoved him down. "Quiet!" He scanned the barn. One main door, chained windows too small to crawl through. A trapdoor they'd already uncovered, but too deep to risk with enemy footsteps above. Options dwindled fast. Shadow's ears flicked. He barked once sharp, urgent, then paced toward the far corner where the boards were weakest. Luke followed, flashlight beam off, every sense screaming. He pried a gap between planks, just wide enough to peek. Outside, 3 men with rifles scanned the yard, their jackets heavy, unmarked, but their posture, military. Two trucks idled with doors open, exhaust pluming white into the night. Megan whispered, "How do we get out?" Luke didn't answer. He weighed possibilities like cards in a losing hand. Fight, flee, or stall. Then the barn door rattled. A fist slammed against the wood. "We know you're in there, deputy. Bring out the girl and the dog. Maddox too. Maybe you walk out breathing." Megan's blood turned to ice. Luke kept his voice low. "They want leverage, not slaughter. That's our opening." Shadow growled again, his body vibrating with the urge to strike. Luke crouched and gave him a hand signal. Still. The shepherd froze, muscles coiled, waiting. Luke called back, steady, "This is sheriff's jurisdiction. Step off the property before you add federal charges to your list." Laughter answered him, harsh, mocking. "You think Calloway cares about charges? You think anyone outside this valley even knows what you've stirred up?" The barn door shuddered under a heavy kick. Boards groaned. Shadow's growl became a bark, booming through the rafters. Megan's hands shook as she raised her camera, snapping quick frames through the cracks. Each flash lit the yard in fragments, faces, weapons, Calloway's trucks, evidence. Luke dragged Maddox upright and shoved him toward the weak boards Shadow had chosen. "He's our shield." Maddox cursed, stumbling. "You'll never make it." Luke pressed the barrel of his pistol against Maddox's shoulder. "Watch me." He smashed the loose boards aside, creating a jagged hole. Freezing air and snow whipped inside. He shoved Maddox through first, then motioned Megan. "Go, now." She hesitated, terror locking her legs. Then Shadow nudged her side, pushing her forward. She scrambled through the gap, boots sinking into knee-deep snow outside. Luke followed last, weapon raised. The night exploded with shouts as spotlights swung their way. "Move," he barked. Shadow bolted ahead, carving a path through drifts. Ears flat, body stretched long. Megan stumbled but ran, clutching her camera. Luke dragged Maddox with one hand, gun steady in the other. Bullets cracked behind them, wood splintering off the barn. Snow sprayed where rounds struck frozen ground. "Down!" Luke shoved Megan behind an old feed wagon, shielding her with his body. Shadow dove beside them, snarling at shadows in the tree line. Maddox wheezed, laughter twisted. "You won't outrun him. Calloway owns every mile between here and town." Luke tightened the cuffs, ignoring him. He peeked over the wagon. The trucks had blocked the main road. Men spread out in formation, disciplined. This wasn't random muscle, this was trained. Megan whispered, "What do we do?" Luke's pulse hammered. "We make them overplay." He raised his radio, voice cutting through static. "Unit 12, requesting immediate backup armed suspects at Hollow Pines Dairy. Shots fired. Repeat, shots fired." Static swallowed his words. No confirmation. Jammed frequency. Megan's face drained. "They're blocking the signal." Shadow barked once, sharp, then turned his head north. Nose high, body tense. Luke followed his gaze. Beyond the ridge, a faint glow cut the dark headlights, distant but approaching. He narrowed his eyes. Friend or foe? The gunmen outside shouted again, their voices closer now. "Last chance, deputy. Drop your weapon and send out the girl." Calloway's done being patient. Luke's jaw locked. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then, suddenly, Maddox spoke, voice calm and cutting through the storm. "If you want to live, you'll give him what he wants." Luke turned on him. "And what's that?" Maddox's smile was slow, cruel. "Not her, not the dog, you." The words hung in the cold like a blade. Megan's heart slammed against her ribs. Shadow growled, hackles raised, pressing against Luke's side as if to shield him. Luke didn't blink. He stared at Maddox, then at the glow rising over the ridge. The new headlights swelled brighter, closer dozens of them. Whoever was coming, they weren't stopping. Snow whipped across the ridge like white fire as the new convoy of headlights surged closer. Deputy Luke Harrison pressed Megan and Shadow low behind the feed wagon, his pistol raised, Maddox still cuffed and grinning like a man who had already seen the ending. Megan's whisper cut through the roar of wind. "Luke, is that backup or more of them?" Luke didn't answer. His gut twisted. Too many vehicles, too fast for the sheriff's department, too quiet for law enforcement protocol. Shadow growled, a deep tremor that rattled through Luke's bones. The first truck skidded into the yard, tires throwing snow. Its door swung open and a figure stepped out, lean and steady in a dark overcoat. A flashlight beam cut through the storm. "Deputy Harrison," a voice shouted. "Daniel Mercer, FBI." Relief surged in Luke's chest so sharp it almost hurt. Behind Mercer, 2 unmarked SUVs and a pair of snow-ready tactical vans rolled in. Agents poured out, weapons up, disciplined and fast. They fanned across the yard, floodlights snapping on, swallowing the barn and silos in harsh white. The men with rifles Calloway's froze, caught in the open. For the first time, hesitation rippled through them. Luke rose slowly, weapon still drawn, his badge catching the light. "Sheriff's office, drop your weapons." A tense beat. Then one by one, rifles clattered into snow. The yard fell into silence, but for engines and the hiss of wind. Maddox spat into the snow, smirking. "You think that saves you? Calloway built this town. FBI or not, you can't dig him out." Mercer crossed quickly, eyes sharp as glass. "We'll see about that." He nodded to two agents. "Get him out of here." They hauled Maddox toward a van. For the first time, his grin faltered, though his eyes burned with promise. Inside the barn, the tactical team swept every corner. Cameras flashed as evidence was bagged, the scorched lockboxes, shredded documents, uniforms. Megan filmed in bursts, her hands steady now, every frame another nail in Calloway's coffin. Luke walked with Mercer through the aisles of crates. "He's been running operations out of here for years. Dogs, money, who knows what else." Mercer's jaw tightened. "And Adam Whitaker?" Luke's throat clenched. He nodded toward the rope fibers, the bloodstains, the Black Creek sign. "He was here. Shadow led us." Mercer crouched, studying the stains. His voice dropped. "Then we've got probable cause to move on Calloway directly." Megan froze. "Tonight?" Mercer's eyes flicked to her, then back to Luke. "He'll know Maddox is gone. We don't have the luxury of time." Luke's pulse kicked. He glanced at Shadow, the dog pacing between them, restless, ears angled toward the north again. He wasn't calm. He was waiting. Hours later, the convoy rolled back into Cedar Creek. Snow had slowed, but the town lay under a brittle silence, every window dark, every rooftop shimmering with frost. In the station, evidence filled the long table. Agents moved with precision, cataloging, photographing, sealing. Megan sat against the wall, exhaustion carving deep lines in her face, but her eyes never stopped following the process. Shadow curled at Luke's feet, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak in the rafters drew his ears. Every gust of wind set his hackles twitching. Luke leaned toward Mercer. "Calloway won't go quietly." Mercer nodded grimly. "Men like him never do." He lowered his voice. "We'll hit the warehouse at dawn. Catch him before he can burn the rest." Luke's jaw tightened. He'd waited years for clean cases to fall into place. Now everything hinged on one strike. Megan rose, her voice low but urgent. "If you go at dawn, he'll see you coming. He's got eyes everywhere. You'll lose surprise." Mercer regarded her, unreadable. "You're suggesting what, Miss Whitaker?" She held his gaze. "Shadow knows where Adam was taken. If Calloway hasn't buried him figuratively or literally, it'll be where he feels safest. His property, his stronghold." Luke's chest went cold. "The farm, wasn't it?" Megan shook her head. "That was storage, a cover. He'd keep the truth where no one would look, somewhere he's hidden in plain sight." Mercer considered, then leaned back. "Then maybe we let the dog decide." Before dawn, the storm thinned into a brittle calm. The sky was iron gray, the mountains cut sharp against its edge. Luke clipped the lead onto Shadow, the shepherd rising like a soldier answering orders. "Find him," Luke whispered. Shadow sniffed the air, circled once, then tugged hard toward the freight yard, where Calloway's empire breathed behind corrugated steel. Luke followed, Mercer and his team in tow, Megan close behind with her camera. The convoy rolled silent, lights dimmed, tires crunching over frost. When they reached the yard, the warehouse loomed massive, humming with hidden power. Trailers lined the lot, diesel fumes faint. A single light burned above the main door like an eye. Shadow stiffened, growl rumbling low. He pulled toward a side fence, nose pressed to the chain link. Luke crouched, following his gaze. Beyond the fence, half hidden by drifts, lay a smaller outbuilding plane, unmarked. But its door reinforced with steel. Mercer signaled his team. They cut the lock silently, boots crunching in unison. Inside, the building was colder, quieter, thick with the scent of oil and damp concrete. Shadow bolted ahead, barking once, pawing at a trap door in the floor. His claws scraped wood, frantic. Luke's heart pounded. He and Mercer heaved the hatch open. The air that wafted up was sour, heavy with time. A narrow staircase dropped into darkness. Megan raised her camera, the flash-catching walls lined with old bank crates, discarded uniforms, and Luke's breath hitched personal belongings scattered in a pile. A wristwatch, a pair of glasses, a photograph stained by damp. Megan's hands trembled. "Adam." Shadow barked sharply, pawing deeper at the shadows, pressing toward a sealed corner of the basement. Luke aimed his flashlight. The beam struck something buried beneath tarps, a mound, cloth, bone, the unmistakable shape of what had once been human. Megan's cry cracked the silence. Mercer's voice was low, steady, but his eyes hardened. "We've got him, and now we've got Calloway." Luke swallowed hard, the weight of justice and grief colliding in his chest. He pressed a hand to Megan's shoulder, steadying her. Shadow leaned against her side, a living anchor as her world shook. But then above them, the slam of a door, heavy footsteps, voices barking orders. Luke froze. Mercer cursed under his breath. "He's here!" And the storm they thought had passed was only just breaking. The basement at Calloway's outbuilding was heavy with silence, broken only by Megan's quiet sobs and the restless shuffle of Shadow's paws on damp concrete. Adam Whitaker's belongings lay scattered, mute testimony of 2 years buried in darkness. Luke Harrison's flashlight beam trembled across the tarps and bones, every flicker carving truth into stone. Then, the slam of the warehouse door above. Voices, rough and commanding, boots pounded against concrete. Mercer swore under his breath, signaling his team. "Positions, now." Agents took cover behind crates, weapons raised. Luke pulled Megan back against the wall, his arm braced across her protectively. Shadow crouched low, hackles bristling, eyes locked on the staircase, where the sound of approaching steps grew louder. The first man appeared, rifle drawn. Mercer's shot cracked the silence, echoing like thunder in the confined space. The intruder dropped, sliding limp down the stairs, but more followed, 3, 4, 5, pouring in like a flood. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the bunker. Splinters and sparks flew as bullets ricocheted. Luke pulled Megan low, shielding her with his body. Shadow launched forward with a snarl, teeth flashing white as he clamped onto the arm of one gunman who had broken through. The man screamed, weapon clattering as Shadow dragged him down, refusing to release. "Go!" Luke barked, shoving Megan toward the far wall. Mercer returned fire, precise and lethal. Agents moved with practiced choreography, but they were outnumbered. Calloway had brought his army, and then the man himself descended. Richard Calloway filled the stairwell, a hulking silhouette framed by the glow of floodlights above. His pale green eyes gleamed, his long coat whipping as he stepped into the chaos. Unlike his men, he carried no rifle, only a heavy pistol, and the kind of authority that made even violence look calculated. "Deputy Harrison," he called over the din, voice steady, almost conversational. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Luke rose from cover, weapon trained on him. "It's over, Calloway. We've got the proof. We've got Adam. You won't walk out of here." Calloway's lips curved. "Proof? In a town I own? A county I pay for?" "No, deputy. You've only signed your death warrant." He raised his pistol. The basement exploded into violence. Shots thundered. Agents fell back. Mercer returned fire, clipping Calloway's shoulder. But the man didn't flinch. He fired again, grazing an agent's arm. Shadow lunged from the side, slamming into Calloway's legs. The giant staggered, curse ripping from his throat, coat flaring as he tried to shake the dog loose. Luke charged, tackling him into the wall. The pistol skidded across the floor. Calloway's fist swung, smashing into Luke's jaw. Pain burst white, but Luke answered with a blow of his own, years of training igniting in brutal rhythm. They grappled, boots scraping against concrete, the weight of 2 men locked in a struggle bigger than either of them. Megan, trembling but steady, snatched up the fallen pistol. Her hands shook, but she leveled it squarely at Calloway. "Enough!" she screamed. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Calloway's chest heaved, pale eyes flicking from her to Luke to the dog still snapping at his coat. Then sirens. The rising wail cut through gunfire. Red and blue lights flared against the frosted windows upstairs. The sheriff's department, state police finally. Calloway snarled, fury twisting his face. He shoved Luke off and bolted for the stairs, blood streaking his coat, shadows snapping at his heels. His men scattered in panic as agents pressed the assault, gunfire cutting them down or driving them into cuffs. Luke sprinted after Calloway, Shadow beside him, Megan behind clutching the pistol with white knuckles. They burst into the night. Snowstorm light reflected off spinning sirens. Deputies and state troopers poured into the yard, weapons raised. For the first time, Calloway faltered his empire, collapsing in real time. Trucks idled, abandoned, his soldiers pinned against walls, hands raised. Luke shouted, voice tearing the night. "Richard Calloway, you're under arrest!" For one heartbeat, Calloway stood still, his breath fogging the frozen air, eyes burning with something like disbelief. Then he raised his hands slowly, blood dripping from his sleeve, lips curling into that same cold smile. Troopers swarmed him, snapping steel onto his wrists. He didn't resist, didn't even blink, only turned his gaze toward Luke. "This isn't over," he murmured. Luke's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to silence the man forever. But the sight of Megan's tear-streaked face behind him, Shadow standing tall at his side, stopped him. It was over for now. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek like a wound healing. The storm passed, leaving rooftops buried in gold light, the valley hushed but alive. At the sheriff's station, reporters gathered, their voices sharp and eager. Cameras flashed as Mercer gave the official statement. Calloway under federal custody, his network dismantled, evidence secured. Megan stood beside Luke, her notebook forgotten. Shadow wore a fresh harness, a simple badge stitched into the leather. Honorary K9, Cedar Creek Sheriff's Office. Luke crouched, fastening the strap, his voice low. "You did it, partner." Shadow leaned into him, eyes steady, tail thumping once against the floor. Megan snapped a single photograph. Not for the paper, not for the story, just for memory. Later, she uploaded her article, "The Dog Who Remembered," how a $1 rescue exposed Cedar Creek's darkest secret. Donations poured in for the new K9 Rescue Foundation she and Luke had begun drafting the night before. Messages from strangers filled her inbox. Hope, grief, prayers, belief. The town breathed again, but Luke couldn't shake Calloway's final words. That night, when Cedar Creek slept under a blanket of quiet snow, Luke sat in his office alone. Files stacked high, evidence locked tight, yet unease lingered like smoke. Shadow dozed at his feet, twitching in dreams. Megan had gone home hours earlier, though her scarf still hung over the back of a chair. The phone rang. Luke answered. A voice, low and gravelly, filtered through static. "Deputy Harrison, you think it ends with Calloway?" Luke froze. "Who is this?" The line crackled, laughter, dark and hollow. Then, silence. Luke set the phone down slowly, staring at Shadow. The shepherd had risen, ears pricked, eyes locked on the dark window. His body trembled, not with fear, but with recognition. Something or someone was out there still. And as the wind moaned through Cedar Creek, Luke realized the nightmare hadn't ended. It had only stepped into the shadows, waiting.